first booked you, which was a while back, it was based on which reserve that was. One of the ones, Star Blanket, announcing that they'd found a bunch of anomalies with their GPR. And even since then, yet another one up in Port Alberni, BC area now is reporting the same thing. Like this issue is just going on and on and on, but there doesn't seem to be any resolution going on.
Yeah, well, this has happened now in 7 or 8 different First Nations around the country, and will happen at more, because the federal government has appropriated a large amount of money for this kind of searching, and so bands are taking advantage of it to hire somebody to push ground penetrating radar around. It's more than that. They also will hire some of their own people to go do sort of oral history projects, talking to members about their memories or perhaps what they have heard about residential schools. So it becomes a fairly major effort, engaging a lot of people. So anyway, you're going to hear more stories like that for sure.
Yeah, well, and oral history, I mean, that's kind of a whole loaded realm on its own. I mean, I understand wanting to give some weight to oral history. You have a culture that's been around that didn't have a written language, so you had to rely on things being passed down. But all the same, we have to recognize and understand that oral history is also notoriously inaccurate at times, and to base something as serious as this on just the oral history, I mean, we need much deeper investigation into some of the things that have been alleged.
Yeah, I think we can use our court system as an example. Oral testimony is admitted all the time in the form of eyewitness testimony, and even some forms of hearsay evidence are admitted if it's expert testimony, for example, scientist or whatever. But oral history in a court proceeding is always subject to testing. First of all, there's a possibility of cross-examination by counsel for the other side. And then there is introduction of other kinds of evidence to compare against oral evidence. Other kinds of evidence would be, for example, written documents. In the case of ancient events, you might have archaeological evidence. Even linguistic evidence about language change can give you ideas about movement of people. So there are many kinds of evidence, and what our courts do is admit oral evidence, but triangulate it against others. And I think that's what we should be doing here. There may be something to these oral accounts that are being gathered, but until they're subject to corroboration, and maybe even against other oral accounts. This is another part of it. You have in a court proceeding, you have a witness for one side, you have a witness for another side. Maybe they saw different things, or don't remember it differently. So you've got to do all this triangulation, and that's what's not being done at the present time.
No, and as you'd said, I mean, that explains a lot of it. I mean, when people have a means to make money, they've kind of created a cottage industry. It was a large amount put out just for GPR surveys and things such as that. And I guess people can't necessarily even be faulted for taking advantage of the program. But, getting to the truth of things, I kind of want to come around back and a bit with the oral history and the Kamloops residential school, which set the whole thing off sort of to begin with. Because a lot of that was based on stories of, it was terrible stories of children basically being murdered, snuck out in the night, buried in an apple orchard. But aside from the oral history of that, there's no other record or anything could be found to corroborate that. Now, the GPR has been done, and they found a bunch of anomalies, but nothing else has been done since. Is there going to be further investigation? And if not, how can we prompt it?
Well, I doubt there will be. Some of the leaders at Kamloops promised that there would be, but it hasn't happened, and more than a year has gone by, and no soil is turned. I think there's a recognition at some level that digging is risky because it might upset the whole apple cart. What they're going to find at Kamloops, I'm pretty sure, is that these soil anomalies in that particular place are due to the installation of a septic field in the 1920s. New sanitation system was put in the school, and there was a big septic tank, and then there was a field of weeping tile to disperse the liquids. About something like 2,000 feet of weeping tile were planted in the same area where the apple orchard now is, and in the same area where they did the testing with the GPR. So that's probably what they're going to find if they ever do actually dig. So I think a lot of people perhaps realize that digging is too risky for the for the cause that they're engaged in. They're much better off by issuing press releases about soil anomalies, hoping that gullible figures in the press, as they often do, will turn those into reports of actual burials. I mean, it was in the headline today on the one from Port Alberni about, more unmarked graves found. Well, no unmarked grave has been found anywhere yet in Canada before or after the reports from Kamloops. There have been now thousands of soil anomalies have been reported, but, well, maybe thousands are too strong, but certainly over 1,000. No, actually thousands is not too strong, because from Lebret in the Qu'Appelle Valley, they claim to have 2,000 soil anomalies. So we're up into the thousands, but there is not a single credible report or any kind of report, really, not even a dubious report of exhuming a human skeleton, child or otherwise. I mean, there's nothing. I've never seen a story go so far with so little evidence. It's really quite remarkable.
Well, yeah, and in oral history, was it? Oh, I can forget the name of it. There was a hospital in Edmonton. It was a tuberculosis hospital way back in its time, and there were some First Nations people claimed that First Nations kids had been buried on the grounds of that, and they did a GPR survey, and they found 33 anomalies, and in 2 different digs, didn't find a single bit of human remains. We didn't hear a heck of a lot about that, though.
No,
you don't hear
about you don't hear about the negative evidence. But so anyway, I'm not holding my breath for any digs to take place. Now, the most recent report is that the federal government has engaged a company from the Netherlands that specializes in looking for remains of missing children, and apparently a serious company with scientific credibility, to come over and consult about the right way to approach this. But we're already getting protests from this side of the water from Native leaders about, well, there wasn't enough consultation. These people are going to be insensitive to our culture. What are their protocols? All on and on. Oh, sorry, Corey, I bumped my rig here. All we're hearing is reasons not to fully cooperate with this investigation from outside. So my guess is that at the end of the day, we will continue to get the reports without any real verification, or in some cases, highly dubious verification, like the bone that was found in part of a skull, I think it was found at Lebret. But that wasn't handled properly. Didn't really tell us very much, and we have no idea that it for sure whether it came from an Indian child who might have been at the school or some other child. I mean, there's all kinds of people who have lived in this Qu'Appelle Valley for a long time. So that's where we are. Frankly, no serious evidence. No evidence that a competent court would grant any credence to.
Oh, and then there's other showings, and it frustrates me to watch the press and the way they cover that, at least a lot of the legacy media. I had the opportunity last summer. I went up to Grouard in northern Alberta. I had to do some stuff in High Prairie, and I went and checked out the Grouard site, and that was a large residential school in an isolated area. It has actually kind of a nice big cathedral there. They use it as a college for First Nations people. Still a bit of a rough town, as many reserves are. But the area, because that was another one where, they found a whole bunch of anomalies, and I went physically to where it was. And yes, it's a Catholic cemetery on a hill. It's fenced in even. So yes, they did their survey inside the cemetery, and you could see, even just looking at the grass, the disturbances. Yes, there certainly was somebody buried there at some time. Chances are, and you see on most reserves, there usually a wooden cross gets put in, and after time it disintegrates and goes away. But this isn't a discovery. This is just establishing a known burial site. But it doesn't get represented that way when it hits the news.
Yeah, this is another angle on it. Some of the reports concern areas that you might say are greenfield. They're just seeing what they might find. In other cases, they are running their machines in areas that are known to have been cemeteries. Usually they're parish cemeteries. I mean, most residential schools were located near towns or villages, and there was a Catholic or Anglican parish there and would have its cemetery. And sometimes children who died at the school were buried there. Not great numbers, but occasionally. But other people were buried there. So you start using ground penetrating radar on an old cemetery. Sure, you're going to find soil anomalies. And if you dug, you might well find skeletons or remains. But would they be the remains of children who somehow disappeared from the school? Well, you'd have to have other evidence. And again, we haven't seen any evidence of that.
Well, and again, like let's just say, for example, they exhumed, or that there really were children murdered and buried in some of these sites. I mean, shouldn't this be then a criminal investigation, a forensic one? I mean, if I'd reported, hey, there's a body buried in my backyard there behind my house, but no, I don't want you digging it up. I just wanted to tell you it's back there. Well, I'm not going to have a choice in the matter anymore. If there's any evidence of it, the police are going to come in and they're going to dig a hole and see just what the heck happened there. But that doesn't seem to be the case here.
No, it's the. I mean, it's a little different in different places, but in most cases, the RCMP aren't involved at all. In a couple of places, the RCMP said, "Well, we're aware of it, but we're letting the First Nation lead the investigation." Well, what does that mean? If, like you say, you find the evidence of a murder in your yard, the police don't say, "Well, you lead the investigation. Call us if you find something."
Yeah.
I think the Mounties probably realize that really there's nothing in this, and that if a body was found, it probably won't be a child from the school, and in any case, it was probably way beyond the point where police could do anything with it. If it's 75 years old, what are the police supposed to do? So, yeah, the police are not involved in any credible way in this. And you're right, they should be. If we took these reports seriously, the police ought to be leading the investigation. There ought to be crime scene tape up and teams exhuming and so on. But none of that is happening. So that gives you an idea that people who are in a position to understand what's going on actually don't take it seriously. It's all a performance. It's a performance, really.
Yeah. So getting to the bottom of the whole thing, though, because this is really causing a lot of damage. I mean, there's a lot of sensitivity between the First Nations and non-First Nations and people who are concerned. And I mean, this is just increasing the division. It's increasing a lot of hurt, whether things really, how they happened or where they happened. We need resolution, though. So I want to get to the hardest part. How are we going to close this off? Because this trend just seems to be snowballing rather than reaching a closure anywhere.
Yeah, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Unfortunate to have to say that, but I don't see any signs that anybody in authority is going to exert any control over it. So I think it will continue to grow. Eventually, everything comes to an end and it will burn itself out, like the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts in the 17th century. And then later on, there will be a period of reflection and people will say, how could we have been so stupid? But these things can go on for a very long time in the absence, maybe especially in the absence of evidence, because the absence of evidence allows people to keep speculating. So I wish I could tell your viewers that it's going to get better, but I fear it's going to get worse. Those are all the signs that we're getting more and more of these reports. They're repeating the same methodology of pushing the GPR around, collecting stories, claiming to have found graves, but not exhuming and not testing in any real way. And as long as they continue to get money from the government to do that, I think it will continue.
It's unfortunate. I know I didn't expect a quick, easy answer, but I was hoping maybe, you've spent a lot of time on the First Nation issue, that you'd had a revelation and realized how we can, fix this, but it was worth a shot.
It's always my weakness as a pundit. I could never foretell the future. I was only good at explaining the past. So,
well, and you've written. I mean, as we close off, you've done a lot of work on this. You wrote First Nations Second Thoughts. I remember rushing out to get that, and at least you're going into the subject of how we can work towards fixing. I mean, the whole system in general is failing. I think Canadians and First Nations people all together. Are you still working on some items now? And where can people find information?
Yeah, most of my research on this topic in recent years has been published by the Fraser Institute. And anybody who's interested, just Google my name in conjunction with Fraser Institute, and you'll find a whole series of studies, many of which have a fiscal focus of like how much is the government spending and how much is it accomplishing. I've written quite a bit about the compensation well, I'm gonna call it a racket, which has evolved since the big apology in 2008, Prime Minister Harper's apology for the residential schools and the compensation that was paid to the so-called survivors then. Well, that in Harper's mind, that was supposed to be the end. This brings it to a close. It turned out to be just the beginning. It was touched off a whole series of further class actions for different categories of First Nations people with different alleged grievances. And then when the Liberals were elected in 2015, Prime Minister Trudeau decided not to contest any of these. So it's like Star Trek, resistance is futile. Ever since 2015, the government simply negotiates a settlement every time somebody comes in with one of these class actions. And so billions and billions of dollars are being shoveled out the back of the truck. The biggest one, I don't know how many of your viewers are aware of this, a $40 billion settlement for alleged harms to children through the child welfare system. But there are many other class actions as well. And the government, in my opinion, is derelict in its duty. It's not contesting these so that they get a true hearing in court. They're saying, well, come on, let's negotiate. We'll put up some money for a settlement. And we're running into the many billions of dollars. And the emotionalism surrounding the missing children and unmarked graves myths is a big part of what drives these. It makes it hard for people to view these grievances in any rational context, because what's more emotional than a missing child, so all this kind of fits together, and sadly, it's maybe a new government will bring a change, but don't know how confident I am. Pierre Poliver's crowd, they voted 4 months ago for a parliamentary resolution that Indian residential schools were actual genocide. I mean, do they even believe what they're saying? If that's true, there should be an international investigation, and this is what happens when you have a real genocide. I mean, they're just saying, they're playing with words, but it builds the emotionalism.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because I was going to speak. I've got it queued up a little more on that. With I have the definition in front of me, at least one definition of what if you're going to declare something a genocide, and it says an assessment of both individual and state responsibility requires a considerable body of evidence and must be carried out by a competent tribunal charged with the task. Well, nothing like that has happened yet. So you're really making a big leap to a very loaded word without having followed the process to really claim if that happened or not.
Yeah, it's a vocabulary inflation. Of course, this happens all the time in politics. People are constantly reaching for more dramatic language. And so they reached for the word genocide and took it off the shelf. And first it was cultural genocide, which is, well, I think it's a bad phrase, but maybe you could justify it as a kind of a metaphor. But very quickly, cultural genocide turned into actual, literal, physical genocide, which is crazy, because if that was true, how can there be more Indigenous people in Canada now than there ever were before the Europeans came? I mean, if it was a genocide, it wasn't a very effective one. But of course, it wasn't a genocide. It was an attempt at acculturation to make it possible for Indigenous people to fit into the new society, which was being created by immigration. And you can argue about whether that was right or wrong, but it wasn't genocidal. So even the leading historians who opened up the whole residential school issue, for example, Jim Miller at the University of Saskatchewan, whose book Shingwalk's Vision was the first one that I read on the topic, and he's very critical of the schools, and he was a pioneering scholar, excellent scholar, but he's flatly stated there was no genocide, and there are no unmarked graves, and there are no missing children. So this thing has just spiraled out of control, and now it's being driven by people that are playing with words that ultimately for financial benefit, I think.
Well, and so if you got another moment, I didn't really want to dive into this, but since it kind of segued into it, I mean, we saw a House of Commons motion from the same one who declared that the residential schools were a genocide. The same member of Parliament now is proposing to make it a crime to deny or question the genocide. Like, this is very scary turf that they're starting to tread into on criminalizing this discussion you and I are having today. By definition, from what this member of parliament wants to enshrine into law, could land us in the legal soup. I mean, this is getting too far, but it doesn't seem to be stopping.
Yeah, well, maybe Professor Miller and I should be packing our toothbrushes. I don't know if they let you bring your own toothbrush into prison or not. There was an excellent column today by Chris Selly in the National Post, which went into some of the details. And after reading that, I think maybe people can relax a little bit. And even if the thing is passed, it's probably going to have qualifications in it which will make it unenforceable. So it will turn out to be probably another exercise in virtue signaling without real world consequences, except for the way in which it debases the climate of public opinion. So if legislation like that is passed, as soon as anybody says something which doesn't agree with current majority opinion, he can be attacked as, purveying hate speech and so on. So this should really be strangled before it gets any further. Again, what will the Conservatives do? What will the Liberals? It's an NDP proposal. The bigger parties are supposed to be, more responsible, but they voted en masse for the original residential schools equals genocide proposal. Will they now come back and vote for this resolution? I hope not, but I can't. Again, I'm not totally optimistic about it.
Yeah, well, we'll watch with interest. I guess the game just keeps rolling on and on. It's just it seems to be in such a bad direction right now. I appreciate you coming on to speak to us today, though, and kind of examine some of these issues a little further and explain a little bit of what's going on there and the work you've done and still are doing. For those guys that are just listening on the audio version, as the professor said, if you Google Tom Flanagan and Fraser Institute, you'll find those sorts of things, or you could find a copy of some of those books out there as well, and things such as that. So thank you for coming on the show again today. I really appreciate it, and maybe one of these days we'll see. Well, as you said, probably in the long run, we'll be using hindsight, or our kids will, and realizing this was a bad endeavor. But if we could speed the progress towards a conclusion, it would be nice.
Well, yeah, final word. What I feel I'm doing, and others, we're not really having much opinion on public opinion right now. I mean, we have people like you who are covering the issue, but we're not getting much traction in the mainstream media. But I hope that we're laying down a factual record that when the time comes for reevaluation, and something like this is happening at a much more accelerated pace with the COVID hysteria. 2 years ago, we were all running around about the sky is falling. Now there's a lot of good scientific studies coming out in referee journals like The Lancet, a lot of stuff coming out say, hey, wait a minute, we way overreacted. So I think there is some value in trying to establish a factual record, even if it doesn't have a big political impact at the moment, but it's there when the time comes.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and hope we can talk again soon.
Okay, Corey, thanks for what you're doing.
Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited access.